We are Rogue Media Sports.
Hey, it's Mark Goodman.
And I'm Alan Light.
On today's podcast, Record Store Day founder Carrie Colleton is joining us to discuss the April 20th RSD special releases.
Plus, we'll talk live with our audience, the Sound Up Pod Squad, and find out who still listens to vinyl. And some updates from the Beatles universe.
Oh, good. Sound Up with Mark Goodman and Alan Light, the only music podcast that matters. Get it on Pandora, Spotify, Apple Podcasts, or wherever you get your podcasts.
It is the Doomsday podcast, and it is Mosley and Werder. And
we don't have first names anymore.
No, we don't need those. And Ed, it's great to be back with you. Great to be back with Frito Nation Productions, Frito Nation Studios. This is kind of his second home we're in today.
You must be overpaying Frito if he can afford two studios.
He's doing really well, and I can assure you it's not off us, but he's done extremely well. And Ed, today we had the opportunity to hear from Jerry Jones with his annual pre-draft news conference. I think if we added it up, Ed, the amount of these we've been to would probably be somewhere in the, and I don't know how they were doing it in the early Jerry days, but I would say somewhere in the neighborhood of 20 to 25 of these things over the years. Ed, have you ever come away from one of these just with an like, oh my gosh, this was unbelievable, or this was some great insight? It's one of those things you just kind of do because it's good anytime you have availability, but this is certainly kind of lying season, they call it in the NFL. And Jerry today was at his meandering best or worst.
And Mike McCarthy would probably say worse, given some of the things that he said as he was finishing his 47-minute availability today, primarily that drafting's not our problem, coaching is, which that's Jerry for you. And, maybe Mike McCarthy can take it given that he's won 12 games, each of the last 2 years. But I still can't think of very many general managers who would say that about their head coach in a press conference format like that. But I think there is value. Jerry, right from the start, Jerry said, basically, you're not going to learn much of anything about what we're going to do in this draft based on your questions or our answers here at the Star today. But he did spend 47 minutes, and anytime you get access to the head coach and, Stephen Jones is second in command, and Jerry, you're going to come away better informed than you were before. And I think they did offer some insights into how they go about this and sort of how they view, what's important in terms of different positions, what goes into their final decision on drafting a running back, for example. I mean, Stephen was pretty adamant, when you're making a pick in the first round, you want to make sure you get a second contract, but maybe running back, if he's a special player, is an exception in that regard. And Zeke Elliott got 2 contracts he probably shouldn't have, and he had to hold out to get it. Yeah. And they destroyed their entire salary cap approach as it pertained to the quarterback, Dak Prescott, Amari Cooper, the wide receiver, because they placated a running back while they still had 2 years of control over him, and took care of him before they did the quarterback and the wide receiver. But I do think there was value in what we heard. It's not as good as, the times I've covered the Cowboys draft. I've sat down with Jerry the day before or so and gotten a better, clear sense of what they're expecting to do. Sometimes the head coach wasn't too pleased with that, Bill Parcells being one I can think of. But yeah, I thought there was value in what they said.
Yeah, I think there's always value because even sometimes in what they don't say, and if they talk for long enough, they're going to say something that might provide just some breadcrumbs along the way. And we'll talk a little bit and hear from Jerry, both what he thinks of Mike McCarthy, and then hear Stephen a little bit on the running back position. And then, Ed, I think we need to take this opportunity in the pre-draft to talk about some things that have happened this offseason. And in some ways, it colored today's proceedings. Both Mike McCarthy having, being reiterated how much of a major say he has in the draft. Well, Ed, since we've last talked, not only does he have maybe a bigger say in the draft, but he has a bigger say in his own offense. And I think this is going to be a way different kind of season, because as long as Mike McCarthy leaned on Kellen Moore to call plays, there was always kind of somebody else to possibly point the finger at when the Cowboys had some struggles. Now, Ed, with Dak, and another contract looming, the lack of playoff wins they've had, all the things that are attached to him, the way he played in that playoff game, and they basically said about Kellen Moore, where it's fair or not, they were saying we needed to eliminate that voice in the room. I want to have a direct line of communication with the quarterback, and they think this is the best way forward. So, Ed, I'll just say, having been out there today and having had now some time to let this wash over you, that Mike McCarthy is going back to his Green Bay days and calling plays. First of all, I think he's happier. I mean, I think he's sort of feeling like they're getting the full Mike McCarthy experience, and I feel like he's sort of been liberated in it to some extent, because I think Mike McCarthy saying, well, I'm going to have more time to spend more time with the defense or the special teams. I think this is been a good thing for him. We'll see if it translates, but he seems pretty happy about it, obviously.
Well, Jerry Jones actually said, not today, but I believe it was at the Combine, that he thinks the biggest improvement offensively will come from McCarthy being the play caller this upcoming season. He said the natural thing to do is to look at how to give more to what Dak can be, was to call on what Mike can bring to the table. So now, only in Dallas could the head coach who called plays in Green Bay for nearly all of his 13 years, when he was the head coach there, but was forbidden to do so or deferred that responsibility to Kellen Moore, Jerry's in-house wonder boy at the time he was hired. But now he's returning to that role, and it's the primary reason the owner thinks the offense will improve this season, right? A guy that Jerry previously said, you're not calling the plays. Mm-hmm. I got a better guy to call the plays. You're not calling the plays. And now all of a sudden you are going to call the plays. And it's the reason I think we're going to be so fantastic on offense this season. I mean, it's odd because it always seemed to me that the value in hiring McCarthy as the head coach was to have him calling plays. And I guess now we'll find out, let's see if the front office provides better players around Dak Prescott, with Mike McCarthy calling the plays than they did with Kellen Moore in his final game with the Cowboys as offensive coordinator in San Francisco, where he's up against the best defense in football 2 years in a row, this time on the road, and they have essentially two playmakers on offense, Tony Pollard and CeeDee Lamb. And Pollard goes out in the first half with the injury. But yeah, it's interesting. I mean, the last time the Cowboys had a head coach who was calling plays was Jason Garrett in 2012. And he wanted to call the plays, and Jerry wanted a head coach to be a walk-around coach. He didn't want the coach to have be responsible for offensive play calling. So it's the first time in 11 years this happened. Yes, McCarthy always lamented the fact that he was not the play caller here. Mm-hmm. He would often make reference to it during the course of a season in his press conferences about the thing he missed the most about being in Dallas was that he was not the play caller. And now, somehow, he's earned enough credibility with the owner to force this change. Make no mistake about it, this was all done by McCarthy. McCarthy wanted to be the play caller. He still loves Dak Prescott as his quarterback and has great faith in him. There's no question the organization feels that way and will extend his contract. But I think there was also the undercurrent, in addition to McCarthy wanting this for himself because he thinks it'll be good for the franchise. McCarthy's got to prove himself. He's in year 4 of a 5-year contract. Mm-hmm. And I think they wanted Dak to know, hey, there's consequences for losing. And this year,
throwing all those interceptions.
The consequence of you failing and us getting eliminated in the second round of the playoffs, in the divisional round of the playoffs, is you're going to have a new offensive coordinator. You're going to have a new quarterback coach. Kellen Moore is not going to be a part of it for the first time since you were drafted in 2016. And your best pal on the team, Ezekiel Elliott, the guy who blitz protects so well and you value as a friend and a teammate. Guess what? His career's over in Dallas. Yeah. So I think there was some, hey, let's get Dak's attention with this. I mean, ultimately, the goal is to improve,
But I think there was also an element to, hey, Dak's got to realize that we got to win. And that if we don't win, there are going to be consequences and there's going to be change.
I agree with that. One of the consequences, which is a nice consequence for Dak, though, because of the way the Cowboys run their business, is that he'll soon be a $50 million a year quarterback. So all those things you said are true, and it may be, hey, this is going to change, this is going to change, this is going to change. His money will only get better.
Well, they can't threaten his career, really, because he's controlled the narrative since he, won 11 straight games in his rookie season and became the obvious starting quarterback.
And then had a horrible injury.
But he got the 2 franchise tags. And so through that and through his salary, he controls his own fate. Like they can't get rid of him without crushing their hopes of being able to put a viable team around whoever the next quarterback is. They can't do that right now. And so the only way they can send a message to him, if he's not afraid of losing his job, the best way you can send a message to the guy is, well, the people you like and who help you, those people are going to lose their job.
Yeah. Yeah, we can threaten everything around you, just not you. Yeah. That is a fascinating thing to think through. Now, I did want to, we were just talking about Mike McCarthy and being emboldened and Jerry deciding, okay, this is our best move forward. Okay, and now y'all are talking directly. And by the way, while Dak did, he had a great relationship with Kellen and said nice things on the way out, Dak has embraced this and said, after maybe one little comment, acting like, how sad it is, he quickly rallied and said, hey, we're going to like this. This was Jerry today talking about Mike McCarthy. And I find it funny that it's not McCarthy saying this. It's Jerry reiterating how Mike has more autonomy and more say and more of a voice with the Cowboys than he did with the Packers, where, by the way, he won a Super Bowl. So maybe not having too big of a voice wasn't such a bad thing. But this is him talking about and then giving him credit for a couple of major moves, successful moves they made in the draft.
One of the reasons that I like our system, and I know it's criticized, but I like our system, is because those iffy picks, those that didn't work out so well, those are Stevens and Clay's.
All right, and Jerry, Stephen, and Mike McCarthy were heard from in today's pre-draft news conference. Ed, interesting that Will McClay, friend of our show, big fan of the Doomsday podcast. We'll probably
Clay,
have him on.
Jerry calls him.
Jerry likes to call him Clay. I think that's just kind of
just a nickname, not a mistake.
Yeah, just a nickname. Certainly would not be
a senior
Jerry
moment.
Forgetting anything. No, he would never do that. I think didn't he say that one time he had a 40-year-old brain or something like that when they examined him? Was it a heart? Yeah, but anyway,
No, it was his brain.
Yeah, I think he said he had a brain of a 40-year-old at age 70. So Jerry's doing just fine in that area. But it wasn't. But, the reason I brought up Will McClay, at one point, in maybe Ireland, when he was doing it before Will McClay, Jeff Ireland, that is, they would have somebody to represent the scouting department at this pre-draft news conference. Kind of interesting that in the last few years they have not done that. And I don't know. I mean, I think Will McClay would be fine if they wanted to bring him along. He does great in media situations. Why do you think that is? Do you think it's just kind of like, hey, here's our triumvirate? We don't really.
Because Jerry's the general manager, and he's sensitive to the perception that he's inadequate in that regard. And if he has Will McClay up there and questions are not being directed to Stephen, who's in charge of player personnel, and draft-related questions and evaluations are being directed to Will McClay, then it kind of takes away the value of Stephen and Jerry being there to talk about scouting. Because Mike's there to talk about players from a coaching perspective, and so they're there to talk about the evaluation process from the scouting front office perspective, and I think that gets diminished if Will McClay is there. But Jerry did, at the very end of the press conference, go out of his way to bring up Will McClay. Like, he wasn't asked about Will McClay, but he talked about, how valuable he is to the franchise. And then somebody asked Jerry, well, why don't you make him the general manager? And Jerry, said, we already got a general manager. That's me. Maybe one day if he can write the big checks like I do, maybe he can have it. We can talk about it. But
But Jerry made it clear he values Will McClay, and who, Will's turned down the opportunity to get other advance his own career and become a general manager in the NFL. There's no question that could have happened had he wanted it, but he values being here. This was, the team his dad loved, and he wants to win a championship here as much as anybody, and it's good that they do value him. And I think Jerry's point with the McCarthy clip we just heard, it's true. Mike had almost no input in Green Bay. Ted Thompson, who's a general manager, the scouts and the personnel people took care of all that. The coaches up there had very little influence in the draft. Mike's influence in the draft was, hey, we just drafted all these guys. You got to play them. And he did. He played them early, and he's done that in Dallas. I think the thing that speaks to how well the Cowboys process works now, and it wasn't always this way. And Steven and Jerry got into another Johnny Manziel joke, right, about Jerry wanting to draft Johnny Manziel. But you just have to, over the last 5 years, Cowboys rookies have played more regular season snaps than any other team. And they played the 6th most last year. And so they've drafted well because these players have not only played, but they've contributed. I mean, look at Deron Bland from last year. Look at their first round pick. He did a tremendous job, Tyron Smith. But I think Jerry's point was this is a more inclusive process than it's ever been. We involve the head coach. We want the head coach's opinion, and like you said, he cited CeeDee Lamb unexpectedly being there, and Mike, thinking he could be an elite receiver, and Trayvon Diggs in the second round as a corner because, Mike said, hey, his ball skills are really unusual to have a defensive player who can, catch the ball better than the receiver he's covering. And so I think that was Jerry's point was, Mike's very involved. We're all involved in this, and it's working great. He couldn't feel better about it.
And, to your point, Tyler Smith, who we had on, we visited with, he fit in beautifully. And I think right away we were looking at those holding penalties. We were looking at the fact that he seemed like almost a developmental guy, like, maybe he can start at guard, but he might not be quite ready for tackle, and he goes out there and he performs extremely well.
He played so well, he replaced Tyron Smith, who may be one of the best left tackles in the history of the game. Certainly a Hall of Famer. And when Tyron Smith is healthy, he's playing right tackle for the first time since his rookie year. I mean, he played well. He did have holding penalties. There were a lot of those. He's got to clean up with his technique and so forth, and I assume he'll continue to improve. And maybe he takes a quantum leap this year, but there were games where he played both left tackle and left guard. He played the most snaps among any rookie in the NFL last year, and played, like I said, at an exceptionally high level. So, and there were a lot of people who questioned whether this was a good fit. And at the last minute, like he goes through training camp in the offseason, being trained to play guard, all of a sudden he's at the most difficult position to play on the offensive line, and bam, he does a pretty fine job there. Although it's interesting that, McCarthy did say, I think at the Combine, that the thing he wants to accomplish as a play caller is to have Dak change fewer plays at the line of scrimmage and just play and do less thinking. And he wants to make sure Dak gets hit less, that Dak plays 20 games next year is his goal, which would mean winning the Super Bowl, obviously, or at least playing it.
Yeah. He's missed, obviously, a pretty large amount of games.
In 2 or 3 of Mike's 3 seasons, he's missed significant portions of playing time because of injuries.
All right. Ed, since people do want to hear from us, our predictions, and we don't have to get in real specifics, but it is kind of nice, I think, for the Cowboys. You heard them talking about running back, tight end, safety was mentioned. The way they've handled things in free agency and trade, getting the wide receiver in Brandon Cooks, getting the cornerback in here, obviously a veteran cornerback. They've sort of shored up some things where in years past we could kind of point and go, you got to have one of these. Oh, you got to have this. And maybe we could make an argument. I mean, I think you can't ever have enough defensive linemen, whether that's pass rushers, defensive tackles. You need sort of interchangeable guys. Do you have any sense for, at 26, obviously so many things have to happen. Do you have a sense of like what the Cowboys like best case scenario would be? Or is the best case scenario truly you just take the best guy? You take the best. And Jerry did say today, he narrowed it down. They could move up they could move back or they could stay at home right there with that number 26 pick.
That's a revelation you don't expect to get.
It's good stuff.
This close to an important offseason event like the draft. But I think you're right that, acquiring Brandon Cooks and acquiring Stephon Gilmore, I think those two veteran players, if they hadn't done those trades, which they did for like 5th round picks, if they hadn't done that, I think you'd say, geez, you might really need a corner with your first pick. Or you really need to get a wide receiver for the reason, I mentioned earlier, they just don't have enough playmakers with speed. But I think Brandon Cooks alleviates that concern on the offensive side like Gilmore does on the defensive side. I do think that the sense I get is they're really interested in the running back position, having let Ezekiel Elliott go this offseason because the money just became too rich for the productivity they were getting. They had a better player that they had to pay $10 million to on the franchise tag, and Tony Pollard. And Stephen Jones said today they'd like to have him for 3 or 4 more years. So I think running back is a position where they'd like to make sure they get somebody who can be a significant complement to Tony Pollard. Defensive, I know talking to some of the defensive coaches right after the season, the 2 positions that they pinpointed they needed help on defense, which, wow, they were great on defense again last year. They're going for 3 years in a row to lead the NFL in takeaways, and they're one of the best pass rushing teams in football. But they need to force teams to throw the football more in known situations, and they need to stop the run to do that. And so I think defensive tackle is one of the positions that they'll target players in this draft. Not a lot of guys there, but certainly somebody could be at 26, whether it's Breesy from Clemson. Brzee. Is that it? Brzee. Okay. Yeah. Well, I like him. They like him. He could be a guy. But I think that's a position where they do need help. I think it's interesting, like when you're as good as you are on defense right now, and we've seen this team transition for the first time to being a defensive-oriented team since Dan Quinn came here. And, the first draft he gets a record 8 defensive players in the draft. So now, do you want to fortify what you're good at on defense and keep winning games that way and make sure that continues? Or do you look at it like McCarthy said today, well, now that I'm calling the plays, we're drafting all offensive players. I mean, he's joking about it, but, or do you devote your highest value picks into improving your weakness, which even though they were 4th in the league in scoring last year, it wasn't first, and they were first the year before. Or do they just think the combination of McCarthy and Prescott's going to take care of all that?
Yeah. You heard the name Bohanna mentioned today. You remember when they had to go
Quentin
after
Bohannon?
Yeah. You remember when they had to go after Hankins?
Yeah.
The big dude in
From
the
the
middle.
Raiders traded for him late in the year. And then re-signed. They have re-signed him.
They did do that. I'll point out one guy later in the draft. People love to hear names and possible, and I just happen to have covered this guy and been around him a lot. Apu Ika, former LSU player who then became a all Big 12 player at Baylor. I know about him for obvious
Touting
reasons.
A Baylor player?
I know this is shocking.
How unusual.
Hey, the one guy I touted,
Petrie?
he became the Texans' best player.
Which is where I'll be this week, by the way.
Jalen Petrie has become maybe the best player on their defense already and going into his second season next year. Oh, by the way, go over real quick the Texans' picks, because that's a pretty – when you said you were going to be there, I was kind of bummed because I like you to be around the Cowboys, but – when you said where all their picks are, it made sense.
Right.
And, yeah, I can see why ESPN would want you to do this.
I've been assigned the Houston Texans, which I've done before. The year they drafted Clowney, I was there for that pick. But they're picking second, and they're picking 12th, and they have the second pick on day 2, which is 33. So they have 3 of the first 33 picks. And obviously, they need a quarterback. We mentioned Dak Prescott tying for the NFL lead with 15 interceptions, even though he missed 5 games. He tied with Texans quarterback Davis Mills. They'll be using one of the picks they got from the Deshaun Watson trade. So the fact that they're going to probably be allowed to take anybody but Bryce Young, which seems to be the player that they've graded the highest among the quarterbacks, and the fact that now they really seem to have convinced people they might not take C.J. Stroud at 2. which is an interesting position to be in. I mean, D'Amico Ryans is a former, defensive player, defensive coordinator. Would they take Will Anderson at 2 and try and get a quarterback at 12, or would they take a defensive player at 2 and try and trade back up from 12 with the 33rd pick to try to get a quarterback in the top 10? It seems inconceivable to me. They had 2 high first round picks last year and didn't take a quarterback. Now you have 2 more high first round picks and you don't take a quarterback again.
Yeah.
Like, you really can't start rebuilding until you have your quarterback. Yeah. Now, if they're, as long as they're right, if their evaluation is that CJ Stroud is not worth the 2nd pick, and they're willing to risk him not being there at 12, or they don't like Will Levis as a quarterback, or Anthony Richardson as a quarterback project, maybe it makes sense not to take a quarterback. But it's hard to imagine they're not going to take a quarterback.
It's coming together to me. I'm always like, what's Ed up to? And then today you had a question about that S2, which is like a cognitive test that's become very popular across the NFL. And not to get too far into it, but C.J. Stroud has been in the news for reportedly not scoring well.
Scored exceedingly poorly, especially compared to the rest of the class.
Yes, I was going to do it.
And he scored poorly on the retake.
Had a retake, yeah, and I've had that happen in school. The retake didn't win about as bad.
How many snaps have you played in the NFL?
I was once approached, by the way, of doing a Plimpton-like, and I said, I was never good enough to even play in the first place. I don't think I should be out there taking snaps
from somebody
in the NFL. Yeah, I played basketball.
Yeah, so you're right. I mean, that's the thing. Like, C.J. Stroud's tape is incredible, and when people have gone and watched him throw, they're totally impressed with the ease with which he makes all the throws. And there's no physical questions about the guy. I mean, he's not a great runner, but people think that, he's a great pocket passer. He has traditional, quarterback size. Size is the issue with Bryce Young, expected to be the number 1 pick of the Carolina Panthers. But the interesting thing this test, he scored very poorly, and McCarthy talked about I think there's 13 teams that subscribe to it. Yeah. And the Cowboys are not only one of them, and McCarthy says it's a great tool to use in evaluating players. But he also said, hey, don't get too far from the tape when you're watching tape. Mm-hmm. And that's the thing with Stroud. Like, he's got great tape. Look what he did to Georgia, last year in the college football playoffs. What do you have, 6 touchdown passes against the best defense in the country? I mean, look how many guys from Georgia are going to get drafted in the first 2 rounds last year and this year. He was incredible. And so I think that becomes really fascinating to see if the Texans really will pass on C.J. Stroud.
Okay. I think you and I ought to try the S2 and just see how we
score. I'll do the Wonderlick and you do the S2.
Gil Brandt desperately tried to get me to do the Wonderlick one time for like a radio
Seems like
stunt.
People have really been questioning not only your mental aptitude, but your physical ability as well.
Yeah, but no, he wanted me to do the Wonderlick. I
think you're in the right profession.
I refused to do it because I just felt like he was going to gear it against me. There was no way I was going to get a true Wonderlick, but I just remember he really wanted me to take that because I think he wanted to poke me with a sharp stick. Okay, real quick, I do want to hear this, and then Ed, one final word on the Zeke thing, which we've mentioned sort of, but just what that sort of means to the franchise. This was Stephen Jones talking about the Cowboys' view of running backs, and it's really interesting in regard to Tony Pollard and how they're kind of looking at him now. Will he have another contract? I mean, I think they would like that, but how do they view that in this draft? And how has that evolved over the years? Here's Stephen on the topic of running backs in the draft.
You asking me?
I really don't.
Well, I've never taken a running back in the first round, so I thought it was for these 2 guys.
Well, I think you have to pay attention, to the history of the running back and what happens. I mean, obviously, we made a conscious decision to take Zeke. I think he was a big part of our success there when we got Dak and Zeke in there together, what he brought to the table. But at the same time, there's very few Emmitt Smiths that play at a high level, a productive level for 10 years. And, what I would say to you, if you're picking, in the top 10, call it top 12, 15, wherever you want to make the cutoff, you really are thinking, boy, we have to have a second contract out of that deal. And so does it affect you when you're thinking about a running back when you're up that high? Yes. as you start to really look at, as you move down the draft, you'd like to hope you're going to have success, that player's going to be a second round, second contract. But it's, in my opinion, not as necessary that you have to necessarily get, to that second contract. And if you happen to see a back, they're at the bottom of the first, that's rare and unique, and he falls because he's a running back, then I would have to think we'd be considering it, especially if we thought he should have been picked, in the top half of the draft. But maybe because he is a running back, he's fallen a little bit. And obviously, a lot of these backs can come in to the NFL and play right away and play at a high level right away. I mean, Zeke proved it. Emmett, we've been fortunate enough to have backs like that. But you can also get really good running backs, as a lot of teams have shown. You can get them in the second and third and fourth round as well. But I think every situation's unique. But I do think you have to pay attention to what, the history and how these backs progress in our league, and how many play at a certain level for 5 years, how many play at a certain level for 7. When does it really that curve start to roll over on you, if you will, in terms of the production.
Jerry, I'd love for you.
All right, and Ed, as we finish up our pre-draft show, we've been doing this for a lot of years. We'll also, one of our most popular podcasts seems to be when we go meet some of the rookies, and they have that rookie camp, and so that's kind of fun. And we'll try to do that and deliver something on that front, Ed, because when we show up there at the Star, it seems like the rookies are always eager to visit with us and get to know us a little bit. I think they're very aware of the Doomsday podcast. But Ed, Zeke is still out there, and in fact, they have repeatedly been asked, would the Cowboys be interested? Could they do a deal with him? There was some thought the Eagles had some interest in Zeke. That was, I think, a crazy thought to fans, that Zeke could be in an Eagles uniform. And here he sits as we head toward this offseason program. I guess Zeke could be in a situation where he waits until camp even. Who knows how this thing will play out. But, Ed, the decision to finally move on from Zeke, at least the way the Cowboys have presented this, and I think Jerry was asked directly about it, did you offer him a pay cut, which they have done with players in the past? Some have chosen to take that. Doug Free, I think, one time said, okay, I'll take the pay cut and stay out of respect for Zeke, which I do think they have. But I think they were ready, knowing they needed to kind of move on, and that they weren't going to be able to find any common ground. They decided to go ahead and release Zeke.
You think maybe they're afraid that if they offered something, you might say yes?
I think that's, yeah.
I think my employers have had that problem.
Yeah, exactly. But what are your thoughts on the first offseason since obviously he was drafted in 2016 without Zeke Elliott, what that does to Dak, the team, the leadership he brought. I mean, he had some ups and downs, and we've chronicled all of it, the suspension, all the things that happened. But he left quite an impact with both fans and again, good and bad, because they'll always view that as a bad contract. But again, that wasn't really his fault. It worked. He held out, and I remember, Ed, you and I were there on the day he signed his deal, and Stephen really very pointedly said to me, I said, well, are you worried about just setting a precedent? And he was like, basically, no, because you better be Zeke Elliott if you're going to do this. And it ended up biting them, the contract they did for him.
Right. Yeah, I think they're very sincere in the respect that they have for him and his intangible value in the locker room. I mean, he's a fierce competitor, gets and deserves credit for playing in situations other guys would not play. But when you're the highest paid running back in football, you can't be have the worst rushing average among 51 running backs with at least 100 touches last year, especially when Tony Pollard ranked 4th in that regard. I think his timing was exquisite, because I think he was endorsed by Jason Garrett. Jason Garrett went into that season knowing that he had to win to keep his job. And so he applied pressure on Zeke's behalf when he was holding out to Jerry to say, hey, look, if you're going to determine whether I get another contract as the head coach or I get fired when the season's over, then I have to have my best player when the season starts. And so for that reason, and because, he had won 2 NFL rushing championships early in his career, Jerry did what he said he wouldn't, and he made him the highest paid running back in football over Todd Gurley at the time. And then, we've seen, last year, as hard as he tried, as much as he wanted, he really was just a short yardage goal line guy. What do you average? 4.6 yards per attempt.
Also like a kettle guy.
Salvation Kettle became known for that. I thought it was interesting that Mike McCarthy's placing so much importance on the running back position and the run game and balance and protecting the defense because he's always seen as a guy and still describes himself as someone who plays through the quarterback. And everything they do is to make the quarterback successful. Yet last year, the Cowboys ran on 45% of their offensive snaps. That's top 6 in the NFL. That's the highest rate for any McCarthy team in his 16 years as a head coach. And he's still talking about doing more of that. Well, if you're talking about doing more of that, you can't just have Tony Pollard and Ronald Jones, the veteran that they signed who barely played with the Chiefs last year. That's why I think there's so much speculation about what would the Cowboys do if Bijan Robinson started to fall outside the top 10, outside the top 15. And I got the sense from listening to all their comments today that the Cowboys would indeed be interested in making phone calls to try to get him should that happen. They didn't speak specifically to him, but the way they talked about the value of the running back position may be different than that of other teams. A lot of the good teams last year were the best running teams. The 49ers have been the best running team in football for several years, and they've knocked the Cowboys out of the playoffs each of the last 2 years with it. So I do think that running back could be a position they wind up going in the first. Now, would they take Jahmyr Gibbs in the first round? He's kind of like a Pollard, but if you're not guaranteed having Pollard beyond this year and you want that type of player, which I think that is the type of back that Mike McCarthy likes in his system, is it worthwhile to have 2 of those guys as long as only one of them is making $10 million? But I think they're very deferential to Zeke, and I think he's earned that. I don't think he's coming back here. I think they've left the door open. I just don't see it happening because this is something you don't want to do twice.
Yeah.
You don't want to say goodbye twice.
No.
And, they've got a good history of drafting running backs in the first round. They've drafted 3 running backs who are Hall of Famers in the first round. Tony Dorsett, Emmitt Smith, and I assume Zeke Elliott has a shot at being in the Hall of Fame if he gets on a team that wins a championship at some point. But they've done pretty well drafting running backs in the first round, and McCarthy indicates that's the way he wants to play. Wants balance in his offense. Doesn't want to put it all on his quarterback, which is not what he did in Green Bay.
No.
The way they're talking about winning now and the way they won last year, that's the way the Jerry era Cowboys have won. It's not at all how the McCarthy Packers won. He's right. Yeah, hey, I won the one time I had a defense ranked in the top 10, I won the Super Bowl. Well, now you've had 2 of those here and you haven't won more than 1 playoff game. But I think it'll also be interesting to see how much influence Dan Quinn has in this draft.
Yeah.
He's been out. You see him out working guys out way more than you do Mike McCarthy. And Jerry's not a traditional general manager. He's not out, at workouts. He goes to the Combine and the Senior Bowl, but he doesn't go watch individual pro days and so forth, with very few exceptions. So, yeah, I think the running back is definitely a position where they could take somebody, and there could be a very talented player at that spot at 26 if they stay there.
It reminds me, who used to try to get involved at the last second of the draft was one of Jerry's proteges. Used to be somebody Jerry liked, and I think in the end they probably didn't like each other. But a guy that's in the process of selling the Commanders. We knew him as the Washington Redskins under Dan Snyder. And one time at the last minute, he decided to jump on a plane and go with his starting quarterback to work 3 wide receivers at the last moment. And right there, they had 2 picks in the second round, and they picked the guy from Oklahoma. They picked a guy from Michigan State. Malcolm Kelly was the guy from Oklahoma. He's a college coach now. Both those guys ended up being the bust. The guy they didn't pick, Jordy Nelson, who ended up having a pretty nice career for the. But yeah, Jerry. And of course, we now know they have some interesting draft night things where they're seeing things are revealed on their camera at times. Or sometimes they'll put their draft board up.
Jerry will show his after they make their pick, he'll show his first round draft grades to justify whatever they did that seems wildly crazy. But I mean, to their credit, like we talk about taking the best player and that this is an opportunity to do that again. Like that's what they did with CeeDee Lamb. Nobody thought they were going to take a wide receiver at that point. I mean, they'd made the Amari Cooper trade, and maybe they wouldn't have had they known CeeDee Lamb was going to be available to them in the first round. But to their credit, they didn't let that stop them from, making a pick and acquiring a very valuable player, somebody who contributed right away and is now proven he's number one receiver type player. And then 2 years ago they went into the draft. Hey, we got to have one of these corners. We got to have J.C. Horn or Pat Surtain, and that's who we want. And those two players go right in front of them. They trade back with a division rival, and they get one of the best defensive players they'll ever have.
Correct. Yeah. I sort of think I like this thought of a defensive tackle. I just know over all these years we've been watching them do this. It's not what they usually end up doing. And several years ago, they found religion in terms of the offensive line. And I do think when in doubt, they now go that route.
Right.
And so we can talk all day about somebody named Ball and somebody named Willetsko. Great offseason. Whoa, he's doing well lifting weights. So
they're moving Ball inside. They drafted him as this huge tackle. Now they're moving him inside. So clearly he's not what they thought he was going to be.
He said, I think I heard McCarthy say outside in, probably play him at some guard, but kind of outside in. Yeah. Well, let's go and Ball.
Those guys really came through when they needed him last year.
Yeah. Let's not get too carried away. Ed, you really came through today. Safe travels as you head to Houston. And I would say if you really want to know the true, like which way they're truly leaning, now, of course, you'll talk to all the people. You're good at kind of, checking it all out. Just call John McClain, see what they've told him. He writes for like a furniture guy now. Mattress Mac. MattressMac.com or Gallery Furniture or whatever that is.
He's had some bad bets recently. He's
Mattress Mac.
He might be liquidating soon.
Mattress Mac is fine. Okay, Frito continuing to do great work at his how many studios does he have now, Ed? Well, I think we just found out about a third studio that maybe he's built in your neighborhood. Appreciate Mark Frito Friedman, Frito Nation Productions. It is the pre-draft edition of the Doomsday podcast.
I thought you wanted to give your pick before we go here.
No,
I don't want to.
You kind of took my thunder away from me. I think... No, I loved it when you said Brian Brzee. Okay. Like I think that's a very, I think I usually give like my 3 picks, but
give 3.
No. I think, I'll give 2. Brzee is, and I do think if they get hot on the trail and if Bijan gets to like in the 15 to 20 range, I could see them trying to roll up the board for him. What would they give up for that? Perhaps a 3rd and a 5th. Do they still have a 5th after giving up that 5th? Isn't that great that the Cowboys are actually...
They have a pick. Yeah. It's the 159th player. Okay. 169th player.
Okay, 3rd round and a 5th rounder. Move up, get him. They'd probably have to give up... They'd have to give up their 1st rounder, a 3rd rounder, and maybe a 5th or 6th to move up that high. I'm just doing that off the cuff. I don't have the point system in front of me. He was saying something about 8,000.
Jimmy's point system to memory.
He was saying something about 8,000 points or something. Right. Jerry was today.
He was trying to overcome criticism for not being as effective in recent drafts as he was early in his term as general manager, and he was trying to make the point that with the Herschel Walker trade, we had 2 drafts worth of picks, high picks.
Yeah, and he was just saying
4 times the overall value of any other draft I've had since.
He was trying to make the point that Clarence E. Hill from the Star-Telegram needed to provide, more context in his story, and I thought that should go without saying. Okay, it is the Doomsday podcast. Ed, thank you. Safe travels.
No, thank you.
Yeah, this was good. Thank you, Frito. And from far north Dallas, it is time to say goodnight. This has been your special episode, pre-draft news conference, the Doomsday Podcast. We'll see you soon.
Hey, it's Mark Goodman.
And I'm Alan Light.
On today's podcast, Record Store Day founder Carrie Colleton is joining us to discuss the April 20th RSD special releases.
Plus, we'll talk live with our audience, the Sound Up Pod Squad, and find out who still listens to vinyl. And some updates from the Beatles universe.
Oh, good. Sound Up with Mark Goodman and Alan Light, the only music podcast that matters. Get it on Pandora, Spotify, Apple Podcasts, or wherever you get your podcasts.